All righty, I'm thinking it's about 10 minutes. We are in Judges chapter 9. Judges chapter 9. Is this thing on? Yeah, it's on. It's on. It just may not be, it may not be adjusted right. I don't know. Is it a little better? Okay, good deal. We're in Judges chapter 9 today. We're going to talk about Abimelech. So Judges chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, and that is, as we know, Gideon, that's his name, contender with Baal, went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and said to them, and to all of his mother's clan, all the citizens of Shechem, ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you to have 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember now that I am your flesh and blood. Nowhere in the book of Judges is Abimelech referred to as a judge. He does assume the role of king. As a matter of fact, he is the first person to claim the role of king and actually be crowned king. There's some, discussion as to whether he was just the king of Manasseh or he was king over Israel in its entirety. Most people seem to think that he was restricted to the tribe of Manasseh. You know, the Bible tells us, and it specifically told the Jews, that thou shalt not covet, part of the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, verse 17. This is Abimelech's first step into breaking God's law, coveting. He's coveting something that is not his. He's coveting this kingship. As a matter of fact, his dad, Gideon, had said when they approached him, no, I will not be a king because God is your king. And if you remember, we discussed already when Samuel is approached about having a king, he gets all bent out of shape, and God tells Samuel, don't worry, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me from being king. God thought he was king of Israel. Gideon thought God was king of Israel. Samuel thought God was king of Israel, and the people should have thought that as well. Abimelech should have thought that, but apparently he didn't. This was something that he wanted. And of course, covetousness, even though this is the last in the list of the Ten Commandments, is probably the first step in breaking most of the Ten Commandments. And he does a pretty good job of that. But anyway, as I said, he was never ever referred to as a judge. He is not a judge, but he is, if anything, an anti-judge. Now, Shechem. What do we know about Shechem? Anything spring to mind? Well, Shechem is a place that is, at least at the time of Jesus, was in what was called Samaria. As a matter of fact, Jesus met a woman at a well just outside of Shechem. Shechem is the place then that Jacob dug a well, because the woman says, are you better than our father Abraham, or father Jacob rather, who gave us this well? And Jesus then, of course, talks about living water. Shechem is also the place where Abraham built his first altar in the promised land. It was the place where Abraham received his first promise that his descendants would bless all of mankind. Genesis chapter 12. Shechem is where Jacob came in, purchased a land from Hamor. And that name pops up in here because the guy Gael would tell the folks in Shechem, says, why are you following this guy since you're not sons of Jacob as he is, because his father's a Jew, but rather you are sons of Hamor. So that name kind of comes back around again. So a lot of things that have happened in and around Shechem. As a matter of fact, Gerizim and Ebal are the two mountains that are around that. And if you remember, when Moses was bringing them into the land, half the tribes were on one, half the tribes were on the other. One recited blessings, the other curses. Blessings for obeying God, curses for not obeying God, back and forth. Tribe of Manasseh was actually on Mount Gerizim, a tribe that recited the blessing. And Abimelech, even though he is of the tribe of Manasseh, is anything but a blessing to these people. Shechem will also become one of the cities of refuge. So a lot that ties around this particular city. So Abimelech makes his proposition. He asked his relatives to go into all of Shechem, or at least all of the wise men of Shechem, or the leaders of Shechem, and convince them, just kind of put it in front. Would you like to obey 70 guys, or you just want to follow one? Give you the option. Want 70 leaders, or you just want one? Most of us would think, well, one is probably better than 70 because you can't please all 70. But on the other side, these 70 brothers have never indicated any desire to be king. And as I said before, their dad had already said, no, I'm not going to be king. Even though, as we pointed out last week, he proceeds to live like a king. The one thing that I did not say last week, but I probably ought to say this week regarding Gideon. Gideon is such a disappointment. Is he not? I mean, this guy could have gotten anything that he wanted. They wanted him to be king. He could have had anything that he wanted, and he opts for gold to build an idol. He could have had anything he wanted. Why did he not do what he should have done and demand that they give up their idols? Why did he not do what he should have done and demand that idol worship go away? Why did he not do what he should have done and continue to follow God? That's rhetorical. You don't have to answer. But the other thing that strikes me as I'm asking that question, and I'm stating the obvious, that he was such a disappointment, his name appears in Hebrews chapter 11 in that hall of faith. Now, how do you explain that? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? I'll fall back on the grace of God. That's the only thing that can explain it. We know the history of all of those people that are listed there in Hebrews chapter 11. Most of us assume that after they've done their good deed, they died, so they were on the good side. And yet it doesn't appear that way with Gideon. We don't know about the end of his life. A lot of us has written off Solomon, because he married these women that turned his heart away from God. Why are we drawing that line there? I don't know. I'm really, really, really careful about who I try to put into heaven and take out of heaven, because it's not my job. And I don't have all the knowledge. And I sure don't want to take God's place. And I think you're in God's place when you're doing that. But I just throw that out there, because Gideon had the opportunity to lead Israel in the right direction for a long time. Instead, he creates an idol that the scripture says was a thorn to his own family, let alone everybody else. All right, anyway. Back to Abimelech. The people of the town heard this proposition, and they were inclined to follow Abimelech. And they said, after all, he is our brother. So they take money from the idol's temple, and they give it to Gideon, who in turn takes that and hires some disreputable folks. Folks probably of the same ilk that he is, They're disreputable, they're lousy people, and he hires them with this money. So now he is tied into this Baal worship, getting his funding from the temple. And they take him then to the great tree at Shechem to crown him as king. Now this great tree is one that was on the property that was purchased by Jacob. When Jacob cleared the idols out, he buried them at this tree. So it was known as the diviner's tree or the sorcerer's tree, this great tree that's here outside of Shechem. This is where he is crowned king. It's also later where Rehoboam, Solomon's son, will be crowned king. But it's also where Jeroboam will take his position as king, replacing Rehoboam for 10 tribes, right? So there again, a lot happens here at Shechem. Then he takes his worthless fellows and goes to his father's home in Ophrah and proceeds to kill off all of his half-brothers. Here again, it's kind of confusing to me because it says he kills 70 of them and one got away. And I don't know if Jotham is the 71st son or he was one of the 70, but he didn't actually kill 70, he only killed 69. You can figure that out if you want to, but it's confusing to me because it sounds like he killed 70. It says that in a couple of different places, but it also says that Jotham got away. The youngest one got away. So I don't know if he killed 70 or if he killed 69, but the youngest one managed to flee and get away. Why did he do that? Well, back in Judges chapter 8, the last few verses, no sooner than Gideon had died, the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith, that is the Baal of the covenant, as their God. They did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued from the hand of their enemies. They also failed to show kindness to the family of Gideon and for all the things that he had done for them. So now we've added to thou shalt not covet. Now we've got thou shalt not have other gods before me, and you shall not make a graven image for yourself. So he takes care of the first and second of the 10 commandments. Now he adds the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. He's just executed 69 or 70 of his half-brothers. It's bad enough when you kill somebody. I think it's probably even worse when you kill your brother. Now he is in the company with Cain. He is in the company with Absalom. He is in the company with Jehoram. And you know what Jesus says in the New Testament about your brother? Does he even address murdering your brother? That's an easy one. No, he doesn't address that. What does he say about hate? What does he say about hating your brother? Don't do it, right? And he says not only that, don't call your brother some kind of bad name. Don't hate your brother. Don't call your brother by some bad name. And what else? Don't think bad things about your brother. Jesus gets right down to the heart of it, doesn't he? He gets right down to your heart with respect to your brother. This guy has just murdered 69 of his brothers or 70 of his brothers, depending on how you figure that out. Jesus said, you don't even have bad thoughts about your brother, let alone call him bad names or hate him. You don't do any of that. So this younger brother decides that he needs to do something. So he goes to Mount Gerizim, climbs about halfway up or maybe all the way to the top. Anyway, he climbs up that hill far enough that he can be heard by the crowd and proceeds to tell them a parable. Now, if you notice there in number 4, it doesn't read a parable because last night, about the time I was trying to convert my lesson plan into a handout, the house went dark. We had a power outage. It was out for an hour or so. I don't know. I went to bed. Got up this morning and tried to slice and dice my lesson into that. And I noticed when I was on the copier back here this morning, it's like, oh, it doesn't say parable. So number 4, you can add a parable in there. He was telling a parable. Now, this is probably the first parable that is recorded in the Bible. It is not the only one that is in the Old Testament. Most of you remember a parable that came about when David had killed Uriah, right? and Nathan comes, and he tells him a parable about a ewe lamb. So that one is also in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel 12, 1 and following. Also, a woman of Tekoa comes and tells David a parable in 2 Samuel 14 related to his son. And then there's a parable of the thistle in 2 Kings 14, parable of the vineyard in Isaiah 5. And then Jeremiah and Ezekiel are almost all parables. They're parables all the way through that. Some are normal parables where you're talking about a parable. The others are acting out. Jeremiah and Ezekiel, much of their writing was they're acting out a parable. So lots of parables in the Old Testament. So Jesus is not the only one that told parables, but certainly he told a bunch. So he didn't invent that. It was there already. And you'll notice also in number 5, there's a double parenthesis at the end of that. But, you know, when you're in a hurry and you don't get time to review it, that kind of stuff slips up. If you find any other things, that's fine. Just fix it. So, what's this parable about? Well, Jotham tells a parable about trees. And he says the trees wanted a leader. So the trees come to the olive tree first and ask him or them to be the leader over the other trees. But the olive tree says, well, I can't do that. My oil is valuable. I'd have to give that up in order to be king. So then he turns, or according to his parable, goes to the fig tree next and says, come, be our king. The fig tree says, well, I can't do that. My sweet fruit, I'd have to give it up. If I'm king, I can't do that. So then turns to the vine. And the vine says, well, I can't be king because the vine that I have, my vine, makes grapes, the clusters of which make wine that makes the gods and the people happy. So then they turn to the bramble bush or the briar. And so, well, you come be our king. Now, the briar has no useful purpose whatsoever. It can't provide shade. It has no fruit. It's really not even good for burning. As a matter of fact, some fires would start in the summer, and through a bramble bush, it burns hot and fast. It would actually even threaten the trees, but you wouldn't want it in your fireplace because it's not going to provide you any heat, not for any time to count. It burns fast, it burns hot, but then it's gone. So it's really useless. As a matter of fact, it can't even provide shade. And yet, they're wanting the bramble or the briar bush to be the king. You remember what Jesus said in the parable of the sower? What happened to the seed that fell amongst the thorns? Choked out, right? No fruit. Plants didn't amount to anything. So even when Jesus is talking about briars, they're of no use. And essentially, that's what Jotham is saying here. It is of no use. David even makes a use of the image of the burning bramble in 2 Samuel 23. Isaiah does in Isaiah chapter 9. Useless. So then Jotham offers the people of Shechem kind of a blessing or a curse. That's interesting. He's on a mount of blessing, but he's offering the people a blessing or a curse. He says, if you have acted honorably, if you have acted honorably in making Abimelech your king, then may God's joy come on you and Abimelech. However, if you have acted despitefully, may the fire from the bramble consume you and him. And as we'll find out later, that's exactly what happens. He even inserts kind of a little parenthetic note there where he says, and to think, my father fought for you, risked his life for you to rescue you from the hand of Midian. But today you have revolted against my father's family, murdered his 70 sons on a single stone, and made Abimelech, the son of a slave girl, king over the citizens of Shechem, because he is your brother. Jotham is not criticizing necessarily kingship, but he is criticizing the idea of having a king that is worthless. Because if you figured out from his little parable, the bramble bush is Abimelech. He's useless, he's worthless. He can't provide you anything. Whereas his dad had God leading him, Abimelech is on his own. Well, he's got that Baal god, but he certainly does not have any real God helping him out. So he offers a challenge to him. If you've acted honorably, good things will happen. If you have not, then bad things are going to happen. Blake said it in his lesson this morning, but sometimes we don't pay attention to it. But God uses evil people to punish evil people. I'll say that again. God sometimes uses evil people to punish evil people. We get the idea that when something is happening to a bad person, that other person is carrying out God's will. Not necessarily the case. Abimelech here is bad. And he is going to do some more bad things to the folks at Shechem who are bad. That doesn't make him good. It's happened all down through history. When Nebuchadnezzar took over from the Assyrians, he was not a good guy. And yet he exacted God's judgment on the Assyrians. But when the Medo-Persians came in and took over Nebuchadnezzar and that entire group of folks, they were executing God's judgment on him and his people, but they were not good people either. And when the Greeks came in and took over the Medo-Persians, they exacted God's judgment on the Medo-Persians, but the Greeks were not good either. When the Romans came in and took over from the Greeks, they executed God's judgment on the Greeks, but they were not good either. So don't get the idea that God can't use bad people to take care of bad people and make sure his wishes are done. It's kind of like trying to figure out who's in heaven. Above my pay grade. I'm not getting into that. How do you examine that? How do you figure that out? I don't know. I can't figure it out. But just know, he often uses evil people to judge evil people. Jotham then, at the end of his parable, decides it's time to leave. If Abimelech has already killed off all my brothers, then I'm probably next on his hit list anyway. And certainly after making this demonstration here for the people of Shechem and anybody else that might be listening, I'm probably target number one. So he heads out to a place called, I don't know if it's Beer or Beer. It's located in Judah. So he's over here in Manasseh, actually up, I guess, in Manasseh at what is now Syria, or would have been Syria in Jesus' time. So he's heading south and probably west to a little place in Judah where he feels like he's reasonably safe. And apparently he was. We don't really know. Scripture then says Abimelech ruled or governed for 3 years. What's missing in that statement? Because there's a little subnote for each one. Each time God talks about a judge, he says something about the judge. He says about the time that he lived, and he also says about the amount of peace that they enjoyed. He doesn't say that here. There's no mention of peace or rest for the land or for the people. It just says simply, he ruled for 3 years. He ruled for 3 years, and then it says, God's had enough. And so God put a spirit of distrust and animosity between Abimelech and the people of Shechem. And what that means is they didn't trust each other because they're distrustful people to start with. And they didn't trust each other, and now they start working at opposite ends. The people of Shechem are actually going out and raiding parties that would be caravanning through. Well, if word gets out that caravans coming through this area are now susceptible to being raided and robbed, you're going to find a different path, right? You'll take your goods and go a different direction. Well, if they do that, then there's no spending money in Shechem. There's no taxing anything that would come that way. And people are going to wonder if you really know what you're doing. So these people now are robbing Abimelech of any taxes that he might get from the travelers. They're robbing themselves of any revenue that they might get for people staying in their town or buying in their town. Again, that would take more money from Abimelech. And everybody's going to wonder if Abimelech really has control of his people, because they're the ones that are doing the robbing. He can't protect his people. He can't control his people. And he is making it dangerous for all of us. So Abimelech gets all bent out of shape. Abimelech now has decided that he needs to do something. It's interesting here that God actually tells us why he put that evil spirit or that spirit of distrust or that spirit of animosity between these two parties. In verse 23, God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem who acted treacherously against Abimelech. God did this in order that the crime against Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, 70 sons, and the shedding of their blood might be avenged on their brother Abimelech and on the citizens of Shechem who helped him murder his brothers. In opposition to him, these citizens of Shechem sent men to the hilltops to ambush and rob everybody that's passing by. So God said, here's the reason. You know, a lot of times we don't get the reason that God does things. He just does them, and we can figure it out or not figure it out later. But in this particular case, God actually tells us why he did this. This is in response to the murder of those brothers. It is bringing judgment on Abimelech. It is also bringing judgment on the men of Shechem. Now there's a new guy that comes into town, Gael. It tells who his dad was, but all the looking that I can find, I have no idea who he is or where he came from. Most people seem to think that he's a Canaanite because he identifies with the folks of Shechem as being a Canaanite, and making a contrast between the sons of Hamor, which would be a Canaanite that established that particular town of Shechem, and Jacob, which of course is the ancestor then of all the Jews. So he comes into town and he starts working around trying to figure out how he can get control. And the way he did it was similar to what Jeroboam did to Rehoboam much later. He's like, I'm here, I'm one of you guys, I understand. The king is not here, he does not understand, and he's living in his own little palace. He's conducting things his own way. You need to listen to me, because I will listen to you. You need to come my way, and we can tell this guy to take a hike. You know, we don't need him anyway. Well, his lieutenant, Abimelech's lieutenant, is in this town. He's kind of running. I think it says he's the governor or kind of the mayor of that town. He hears all of this, and he passes the word on to Abimelech. Says, you need to do something. And now would be the time. Maybe a surprise attack. Bring your folks in, set up overnight. When they go out in the morning, you can attack and take them out. And so he says, okay, that sounds like a good idea to me. I'll do that. And so he does. He sets up, he divides his forces into about 4 different deals, and they set up at various points. When Abimelech, or when Gael rather, comes down to the gate the next morning, he looks out and he sees something on the mountainside. I don't know if it's Ebal or the other one, but he sees something on the mountainside, and he says, "Oh, look, there's an army coming." And of course, Abimelech's lieutenant, he says, "No, it's probably just a shadow that you're seeing up there. It's not really people." But of course, as they get closer, he knows for sure it's people. But his lieutenant says, "Well, it's put up or shut up time. Who is this Abimelech that we should listen to him? I'll get my army and tell him to bring on his best. Now's your time, bud. Here he comes. You go get him." Well, he was really left between a rock and a hard place. He had made this statement already. Here comes the confrontation, and so he mounts his forces, and they go out against Abimelech, and they're routed. Abimelech, it says, killed them all the way back to the gate. Gael gets away. We don't really know where he went, but it says that he and his family were driven away. Whatever of them were not killed were driven away. There again, don't know where he went. But Abimelech then goes and kind of rests for the night. But he's still got this bone to pick with the folks at Shechem. So the next morning, he comes back, and as the folks from Shechem are going out to tend to their fields, their trees, the olive, the fig, the vines, the three big cash crops, they're going out to tend to all of this. Abimelech cuts off the gate. Then sends his forces against all of those people and wipes them out. All those who were trapped outside the gate. Then turns and attacks the city. And we will pick up there next week. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.